Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's shir, Thursday evening of Parshas Bahar B'Chakoisai. Also, the Shabbos is Shabbos Chazak. So, the first question we have, someone asked me last week about the minhag of leaving a bit of the end of the challah. Does it apply only to lechem mishneh or to other bread too? We'll talk about it. I'm not sure how widespread this is, what he's talking about. Well, there's two inyonim here, which I'm not sure how they connect to one another, but okay. So what we have here on the screen is from Simon Kuf Samach Zayin, and that's the dinim of B'tzias HaPas, of breaking bread. And we have here the following. First of all, he writes, and this is the Shulchan Aruch talks about, that when it comes to making a bracha, I cannot make a bracha hamotzi for you unless I am eating also. V'yesh lechel hapruso shebotza oleho. The piece which you break, that piece you should eat from it. Koidem sheyechel pas acher. That the piece which you made the bracha, you should eat before having another piece of bread. V'hu mishum v'shetei nechel lete'ovin. They should be eaten with a passion. V'hu mishum chibuv mitzvah. Eating it with a passion, that would be cherishing the mitzvah. Okay. On this we have now the Mogen Avraham on the side. So you break off a piece, so you should eat from that. I don't understand what's the chiddush, but pashas, you break off, you should eat from that piece. Okay. But he says, now those who say that you should, from the first piece which you break off, you should eat it at the end of the meal. And in order to resolve this, you should eat of the first break of the bread, a little bit from the beginning of the meal and leave a bit till the end of the meal. Now, I haven't seen this being done widespread, of people breaking off and leaving a piece till the end of the meal. But so this is, and I tried to look up the shalom, which is the source of it, which I didn't manage to, didn't find it there. The piece which you broke off when you made the brocha, it's got a chashivas. You made a brocha on it, so don't give that to a nochri and nor to an animal. Okay, so this is the first thing, that there's something. If you ask the question, if there's something about chashivas of the first break of bread, is it got to do with lechem mishneh? No, it's got to do with having said the bracha hamotzi. And all of this is a little bit obsolete nowadays, that we have this invention of sliced bread. So with the whole business of bitzio, of b'tzias hapas, of breaking bread, is only we only have on Shabbos, unless you have your own homemade bread, whatever, you cut it yourself. But well, it's not so common. Right. Then we have the other thing, which is much more common. People have a minhag of cutting off the first piece and leaving it and not using it. So this on the screen is from the Sefer Shmiras Guf Nefesh. This is I took a picture with my camera because it's not on. No, it's a chochma. So he writes here, "Hine marga lebefume de inshe." It's common saying that if one eats the edge of the bread, it's kosher l'shichacha. It's conducive to forgetfulness, and because of this, many people cut off the end of the bread. He says, I haven't found any source to say that this is kosher l'shichacha. He then says he saw in the Minchas Yitzchak in volume 9, he also is wondering the source. The Minchas Yitzchak is actually quite exceptional. Let's wait. Sorry. All right. So I was saying about the Minchas Yitzchak being actually outstanding in the amount of references which he gives. But then this is the writer of the Sefer Shmiras Guf Nefesh. He says in the Sefer Tameh HaMinhagim, he quotes from the Yaras Dvash that he says the following: there is a preference to make a brocha on the part which is more crusty, where it first starts forming crust. And the reason is because that's where the chitzonim take hold. I'm going to go to the next slide and we'll explain this a little bit more. There is a famous Gemara in Sanhedrin that Rebbe Avohu was talking about the three kings who were exceptional in the amount of Avodah Zorah they did. And then Rebbe Avohu fell ill, and he made a decision that he's not going to start expounding about the crooked, the corruption of those kings. He then recovered, and he got back to his old ways of ranting about these Avodah Zarah. So the Talmidim said, "Didn't you accept upon yourself that you're not going to speak about this?" Which he said, but they didn't do tshuva, something to that. And then he says, in the yeshiva of Rav Ashi, talking about those three kings, and he said, "Lemocho niftach b'chavrin." Tomorrow we're going to talk about our mate, as I'm referring to Menashe. That night, also Menashe is chazal bechelme, and Menashe comes to Rav Ashi in his dream, and he says, Menashe says to Rav Ashi, "Chavroch v'chaver davuch kol yislon." You call me your friend? You call me your father's friend? Yeah, really? Mehecha boyos lemishra hamoitzi. Do you know when you make hamoitzi, where you meant to break off? So in his dream, says Rav Ashi, Lo Yadana, I don't know anything about this. So Menashe in his dream says to him, where you meant to make hamoitzi, where you meant to break off, you don't know. And you call me your mate? So Rav Ashi in his dream says to Menashe, he says, Agmarili, teach me. And tomorrow I'll take it over in your name. And so Menashe tells him in the dream that he should break off from where the korim bishula, where it forms the crust. What the discussion in Rashi Tosfos, it means the top or the bottom. All right. So then Rav Ashi says to Menashe in the dream, the difference of, I don't know, 600 years, whatever. And he says, Me'achad chakimit kim to kulei, since you're so knowledgeable, my time why are you so obsessed in worshipping idols? To which Menashe says to Rav Ashi in his dream, Im habes hosem, had you been in my time, habes nekitna shipula de glime or hites babasroi. You would have lifted the hem, you would have lifted the bottom of your tunic to be able to run after me, to run to Avodah Zarah. So it was an enormous passion to Avodah Zarah at the time. Okay, but when you read this Gemara and you wonder what has got one to the other, Menashe has an obsession with Avodah Zarah, and when he challenges Rav Ashi, of all things, he challenges Rav Ashi about breaking bread. So now this is from the Yaras Dvash. Yaras Dvash is from Yebirnis and Eibeshitz, Mamish from the most brilliant, from the Gedolei Yisrael, and he says, this is why you're meant to make the brocha on the part which is ripened, and that is readied. Because the chitzonim, that means the negative elements, they try to get a foothold dafka in the beginning. And that's why, dafka, that's where you should make the brocha and to sanctify it and to take away their koyach. And this is why he says that he refers to him as chavrin, etc. And you don't know about this. And he says that was his weak point. And he kol hagodel mechavere is yitzrei godel mechavere. And therefore Menashe is saying that because he was perhaps in a lead position, that's why he was more vulnerable to the temptation of Avodah Zarah. He says Menashe hoy godel me'ed. And therefore he had the Yetzer Hara. It looked for him. And this is where, okay, Meshver Olav Sholem used to speak about this. He used to quote a source about Pinchas with Zimri, the whole story that what was her name, Cosby. So she wanted to go to the Godel, and she wanted to seduce Moshe Rabbeinu. And Zimri got involved in order to, he said, I am the Godel, in order to protect Moshe. That's some kind of medrash. But without going to that whole story, meanwhile, this idea that the lead person or the leading is where there's the greater temptation, greater challenge. And so that's the significance of the beginning of the bread, where it begins to get ready. That's a greater. Um, it's got greater resource there, and therefore there's a temptation of klippa there also. So let's come back to this is what he writes over here. This is the Shmiras Guf Nefesh. The Sefer Tamin Hogi quotes the Yaras Dvash about the beginning of the bread. And that's where the Chitzonim have a greater temptation, obsession, and therefore you should counter that by making a bracha on it. And then he says, and that's always you have the beginning. Sitra starts tries to challenge at the beginning. Klipo kodma lepri, the shell comes before the fruit. But Nira, this is from the Sefer Tamim and Hogim. That's the reason for that people, when you have a loaf of bread which has got an end or two ends, to cut off a little bit from the end to kind of take away their koyach. Remez lozeh kol orel lo yochal bay. That end is like the oral, and to not to so he seems to be saying of cutting it off and discarding it. So what I find quite interesting is that we've had the Shulchan Aruch talking about the piece of hamoitzi, and that's one thing. That doesn't mean it's the end. Fakir, you can cut into the bread a little bit away from the end, but as the end bit, then there is this minhag which many know of, and I myself, I can say I wasn't one of those who knew the reason. This is a reason for discarding the very end. Okay. Someone asked, what do you do with round challahs? So, okay, with round challahs, perhaps there is no end, and then they don't have to worry about this. I mean, he's quite. He says this. He says pass, which has got an end or two ends, but otherwise, okay. That was our first point. Our second point was about tearing off plastic from a roll of plastic for a tablecloth. So what you have on the screen is from the Sefer from Rav Forkash, Soll sein gesund from Yerushalayim, Shabbos Halacha, Volume 4. And he says the first thing, read the Havahora, the clarification there. He says at the beginning, things should be prepared before Shabbos, and whether it's paper or cloth, whatever it may be, should be prepared before Shabbos to avoid shilas. And then you get in some. It's not everything that you're going to say is agreed. Is how you say is a consensus in it. But he looks at this nylon roll. Nylon is American, sorry, Hebrew for plastic. Yeah. So you have this plastic roll, which is 50 meters, 100 meters. And you normally what you do is you before Shabbos you cut off a length of 3 meters, 4 meters, whatever you need for your tables, and then on Shabbos when it comes to make your kiddush, you'll take those things and you cover your table with them. So what are the concerns here? So he says, is it mechatech? So mechatech is one of the lamed tes melachas. Now, if you had a sheet of leather and you wanted to make sandals, so then you would have probably a stencil of some sort, and you'd score the leather and you'd cut it to a specific size. You don't want it wider, you don't want it narrower. That's mechatech b'mido. So now he says here with this length of tablecloth, It's not a problem of mechatech because it doesn't matter to you. It's a little bit longer or shorter. It's not important to you. So it's not a problem of mechatech. So there's no isum in HaTorah here. Now, this is also, of course, according to the Alter Rebbe, who says that koireya as a melocha is koireya only where there was a stitching, where there was an adhesion. So to tear off a paper from a pad where it's stuck together, that would be koireya. But to tear through a piece of paper, the Alter Rebbe doesn't see that as the melocha of koireya. So tearing is not the problem. The problem is tikkun keli. So let's say I need to wipe my nose, and I have a sheet of tissue which is a jumbo size. It's a meter square, and my nose isn't as big as that. So therefore, I want to tear off a piece to be able to more conveniently wipe my nose. That's called tikkun keli. It's not a sederaisa, but it is a midrabanan also. And that's why every Yiddish house, before Shabbos, make sure you have, instead of just rolls of paper in the room without a mezuzah, you also have flat sheets, etc., which are not connected, not to tear off. Because to tear off a piece from the roll is making it now convenient size. And making something a convenient size comes into tikkun keli. Same thing, you have kitchen towel. So kitchen towel, it's not so comfortable to wipe the table whilst holding a roll. So it's more convenient to tear off the roll and wipe. Therefore, you mustn't do that. You mustn't tear off the roll on Shabbos because of tikkun keli. Or you want to take a piece of silver foil. You want to cover a bowl with a silver foil. If it's still attached to the roll, it's not convenient. So you want to tear it off the roll and then use it. Well, to make something which wasn't so usable, to make it usable, that comes on a tikkun keli. And that's where the roll of tablecloth has got is more lenient in this respect. Because the roll of tablecloth, you could really use it as a tablecloth and put the roll under the table. You could use it perfectly well. And on that basis, he is matir to tear off a length because he doesn't see it as metaken keli, which is interesting. At the end, he says tearing one sheet of cloth into two, that wouldn't be okay to create two tablecloths. That is not okay. All right, so just to summarize that, is there a heter to tear stretches of plastic tablecloth off a roll? So it's not Olachat Chila. Olachat Chila you should prepare before Shabbos. If you got stuck in a matziv that you don't have, and so there is room to be able to do so. It's in not being particular of the size. It's just approximate. Yeah. Okay, that's Rav Horkash for you. Let's move on to the next question. I was actually on Sunday. I was in Dublin. There was a Chanukah Sabayis of a new Beis Chabad there, which is particularly they dedicated a new library. Very beautiful event. And so someone there asked me a question whilst I was there. He was asking me when you daven Shemini Esrei. So there's a thing of not walking in front of someone else who's davening. It's a lavo neged hamispal. And so is it because of Kovod Hashchina, the person is where he's davening, so the Shechina is present with him, so you are in a sense violating the presence of the Shechina there, or is it that you shouldn't disturb the person? That's a difference. These two approaches, let's say if you walk behind, according to the Zohar, even behind them is a concern, but in front of them is a sort of also lavineged hamispal. Some say if the person's got his eyes closed, then you're not disturbing him, then that would be okay. According to the reason of the Zohar, that also wouldn't be okay, but fine. Here's the question. In this mamish, 5 minutes after I was speaking to him, I myself was nichshel in this. Because they started Ashrei, and I was finishing Karbonis. So There's something in like Morgan Avrom that even if you're late, you don't leave for Ashrei for after Shmon Esrei. Ashrei for Mincha is dafka before, not after. So he started this. The fellow, same fellow I was speaking to, he starts Shmon Esrei, and 30 seconds later, I'm starting Shmon Esrei, and he's just behind me. If I walk 3 steps back, so I am in a sense violating his. So am I allowed to do so or not? Now I saw this afterwards, yeah. So this is from the Pisket Shuvas. In this, he addresses this in 2 separate places. And Simon Kuf Beis, which is the din of also Lava Deged HaMispalel, there he gives a list of scenarios where you are allowed to. So let's say I was called up to the Torah, and I want to go up to the Torah, and this guy stands just behind me. But the whole tzibur is waiting, the Sefer Torah is waiting, so there's a bit of an urgency. Can't wait. All right, so I'm allowed to go. I'm allowed to be over neged and lifnei mispal because of the mitzvah of to go over to the Torah. That's what he says. Okay, he gives another few examples. The question here is, now this is what you have on the screen is not from there, it's from Simon Tzadik Hey. And here in the Simon Tzadik Hey, there's a discussion about walking 3 steps before Shmon Esrei. And just to clarify, the 3 steps is primarily walking 3 steps forward, as approaching respectfully towards Kivyochel, approaching the Melech. But in order to step 3 steps forward, we generally step 3 steps back to enable the 3 steps forward. Those 3 steps forward are very choshev. And you see a remez, Moshe Rabbeinu, when he goes up to receive the Torah, he goes beyond the Choshech and the Onon, the Arofel. And then when the Eden were by Har Sinai, they distanced themselves 3 million, and then they came back. And then there's other remozim. Okay, so there are remozim in this, the significance of the 3 steps. But he says 2 points. It's because of its chashivas, it's not a problem of hefsek ben geula letfilah. You see, when the Rebbe davened at the Omed, when the Rebbe was not the Chazan, the Rebbe would step back and wait by Mikomecha. Yeah. But when he was Chazan, he finished off Goal Yithro, and then he stepped back 3 steps. The 3 steps is a hefsek ben geula letfilah. He says it's not a hefsek. But then he says the other point. You shouldn't do the 3 steps if it's going to be in violation of the Dal Amis of someone who's standing behind you. So the 3 steps is a definitely important thing, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of Oiver Lifnei Hamispal. And he brings sources for this. Okay. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Let's move on. So here in Yonah de Yomer, Chaga cheesecake, yeah. So now, someone's asking me, are you allowed to make this cheesecake, this no-bake cheesecake, on Shabbos, on Yom Tov? So my response was, on Yom Tov, there's no shaila. You're allowed to bake bread on Yom Tov. No question. On Shabbos, so how do you make this? So you take cream cheese and you mix with milk, and then you also use, I think she said, jelly powder. And you fold it in, and then somehow it becomes this. So what's the shaila here? So there's one of the lamates malach. This is losh, and we've actually just been learning about this in Shulchan Aruch and Simashin Chaf Aleph, taking powder called flour and adding water, and then it creates a stickiness and it forms a mass. To form a mass is also on Shabbos under lisha, under kneading a dough. So here, my understanding is that the cream cheese may be actually a mass already, but you put in the milk, it probably makes it a little bit loose, and then you put in this jelly powder. The jelly powder has obviously got some kind of stickiness, and that's going to hold it together that much more. So I said that's not okay because of lisha. You're putting in you're binding the stuff into a mass. That's not allowed on Shabbos. Interestingly, someone else asked me a similar question, but much more healthy and less tasty. Am I pronouncing it correct if I say psyllium, or is it a silent P? Okay, never mind. So, are you allowed to? So this is oh, oh, I'm told it's a silent P. So it's psyllium. Okay, and it's some kind of powder, and you add it with to water or water to it, and then it becomes some kind of gel. So that seems to be a problem, yeah. So to make pudding or to make jelly, that for sure is not okay because it's taking the powder and making it into a mass. And my question here was, and I corresponded to this lady, how thick does this become? So if it becomes a mass, then it's a double posture, it's not okay. But then I see in the Shmiras Shabbos Keilchoso, and he says, "V'osu is kain gam im eino oise al yedei ze rak b'li l'racho." Even if it becomes a soft mixture, he also sees it as a problem, and he doesn't really define this. And I wasn't satisfied with the sources which he gave. So if it's mamash something which you can just drink straight, I think that should be no problem. If it's something you would have to use a spoon, etc., then it would come under the question of lisho. I once years ago I asked, well, there's a thing of not dipping food into a liquid on Shabbat, on sorry, without netilas yadayim, tibule b'mashke. So what about something like dipping a cracker into yogurt? Is yogurt considered a mashke or is it considered an oichel? So to dip the a cracker and pick up some cottage cheese is okay. It's oichel. But is yogurt called oichel or mashke? The same yogurt, if you it's as it is, it's set, and if you shake it up, it's going to become runny. So Diane Friedman showed me, and later I saw it in Magen Avraham, a definition like this: something which, in order to swallow, you have to lahapich beloshin. You need to kind of move around with your tongue to move it to enable you to swallow. That's called a food. If you can just drink it straight, that would be considered a drink. So that I think for me that would be the difference. Is this does this at the end remain a drink or does it become a gel? If it becomes a gel, then I would have a problem of making it on Shabbos. Someone is pointing out, Rav Arya, about the previous thing about cutting off the end and of the loaf of bread. Yes, so although people say it's kosher l'shichachom, but there's no evidence for that in sources. Right, let's move on. From all these ruchnistic things, something very gashmiistic. Reuben has lent Shimon an amount of money, and it looks like that Shimon is not in a position to pay back, at least not immediately. So Reuben is thinking, can he take from his Meiser money, and instead of giving out to various worthy causes, he will withhold some of the Meiser for himself. And in this way, he'll pay off the debt which Shimon owes him and make everyone happy. So this is in Ramo, and Simon addresses this mamash. Misha mafrish masroisov, a person who is accustomed to set aside his meiser, vehilva leoni, and he lent money to a poor man, mishaloi, not from his meiser money, he took from his regular money, and he lent someone. So then mafrish maser shaloi, he's allowed to take from his meiser, umachashev al zeh shehilva leoni, umakev la'atzmei mashe hifrish. Instead of distributing the meiser elsewhere, he can take from the meiser pouch and put it to his regular pouch to settle the debt. That is only if the poor person is still alive, etc. Fine. So we have here that you can settle this from mice. In the Shach, on the here in Simulation of Zion Yeridea, he says that's also poshut. He says you should, you should give it to a third party. Let's say the person borrowed £500. So he says, take the £500 from your Meiser money or in installments, and you give it to Levi. And you say, Levi, be kind of this money on behalf of Shimon, and then give it back to me in payment. So there should be the motions of giving it away and then taking it back. That's how the Shach says, and he brings proofs to that. So what is the bottom line? So I'm looking here. This is from the Sefer Psachim with Shuvas, and he says you can. Some say you should be dafka that the oni should be koina somehow through a third party. But Yesh Oimrim, this is the Noida Yehuda who says, even if you didn't give it to didn't give it to a third party, you just want to set aside from one pocket to the other pocket. Yesh lismech al zeh rak b'moed shel ma'aser ksofim. So the Noida Yehuda is saying, ma'aser is a very fine minig. It's not like the mitzvah of giving truma or ma'aser. There's this discussion in Gemara. If a person if someone owes you, if a kohen owes you money, are you allowed to keep your truma? That's the discussion in the background over there. But Meiser Ksofim is not as chomur, and therefore Meiser you're allowed to retain from your Meiser money in order to settle a debt owed to you by a poor person. If you had stocker money, if you had an amount of it was ready tzedakah rather than meiser. Tzedakah means it's ready to be put in a pushka, whatever it may be, or you collected tzedakah, then you'd have to, if you collected tzedakah for poor people, could you now put the money in your pocket? And someone owes you money, so then there you'd have to give it to a third party and then to take the money back for yourself to settle the debt. I'm not sure actually about that last example, whether you could do that, or whether you could do collecting money and then use the money for debts of poor people. I'm not sure about that. Let's move on. So someone asked me a practical question about do you have to, there was recently in one of these Hamish news sheets, someone wrote a letter about cashew nuts and saying that it's an obligation to open cashew nuts to check for infestation. My personal experience is I have occasionally found infestation in cashew nut, but I've gone through probably hundreds of those and not found anything inside. And therefore, is it a chiyuv to every time you have a cashew nut to open it up? B'hashgacha protis, I traveled this morning and there was a person who actually works in the Kadassia, and his department is Bedikas Toiloim in the dealing with infestation, and he confirmed my position about this. And here you have this in Shulchan Aruch. This is in Siman Pei Daled, which talks about infestation of bugs, etc., in food. And he says, mini peiris, fruit with darkon lahaslia, which tend to develop worms when they are on the tree, then you'd have to be boidek the fruit before eating. But then he says, I guess I've missed that piece from the screen. But if it's a fruit, which is a bit further in the same if it's a fruit which is not normal to develop, to have worms, then you're not mechuyev to be baidek. And what this fellow says in the Kadassia, what they do, they have various like Tropco, they've got various products, nuts, etc., with a hechsher. So they will do a sample check here and there, one or two, and see if they're good. Obviously, if they're not, if they find a few which are not good, they're going to discard or something. He said to me something also, another interesting thing. They use a vibrator. So let's say there's some kind of nuts which may sometimes have infestation on the outside, mites or whatever, and so they put the nuts in a vibrator and they shake it up, and if there will be little bugs attached, then the likelihood is that they will fall off the surface of the fruit onto the nuts onto the surface beneath, and that's one way they can check easily whether whether this batch is infested or not. Okay, but I think that occasionally we're checking one or two, but if you buy good quality produce, It may cost a little bit more, but the infestation is going to be quite low and not really such a worry. If you buy cheap in a place which is not so hygienic, then yes, the likelihood of infestation, he says, is higher. Let's move on. So as I was just yesterday, I was in Italy looking at the planting of their sorghum and talking about it comes up about Orla. So I'm going to first deal with question number 9 and then go back to question number 8. Question number 9, does Orla apply to replanted saplings? And this I find a little bit interesting. It says in Shulchan Aruch, if you plant a seed or a yichur, you plant a branch. That's one way of propagating. You take cuttings, which I just saw yesterday. Farmer he took a branch off an estric tree, and then he stripped off all the leaves, and then he just put it in the soil and trimmed it. And in a few years, that will be a tree with proper watering, etc. So that would be planting a yichur, planting a branch. Oishe oka kol ha'ilon. If you uprooted an entire tree, not a b'mokim acher. So then you're going to be also subject to Orla. You're going to have to wait 3 years from the replanting. That's the Poshtadin. But then it says here in Sifyut Test, in the same Siman, Reish Tzadik Dalet, if a tree was uprooted by wind, or it was washed away by the river, and it was taken to another place, now he starts going into detail. And it's also pulled away the tree with a mass of earth with the roots of the tree. So then the approach is if it was able to live with the original offer, with the original earth, then you don't have to start Orla again. So this is my question. Here it seems to be and how do you reconcile? Here it says if you uprooted a tree and you plant it elsewhere, you have to start Orla again. Here it says if a tree was washed away or ripped up by a wind and replanted, then if it had enough earth with it, then you don't have to start Orla again. Is there a difference between those two halachas? That's what's bothering me. Someone to say this is B'diavad, this is a Chachila, it's not so clear. And so when you go to a garden center and you buy a tree, a small tree, and it has with it earth. So what would it be able to live on that earth? So some of the Meforshim say that it has to be able to live on the earth for 3 years. That may actually be unlikely. With the amount of earth which you buy in B&Q, a garden center may not be able to last 3 years with that little bit of earth. What the poskim say is, what I've seen, that in Chutz La'aretz you can rely l'kula, that if it's a bit of earth, it could live for the for foreseeable future. With that amount of earth, then you don't have to start Orla again. I want to I mentioned this before, but it's a very common thing. I'm talking about buying little trees. It's very, very common that the trees are, let's say you buy an apple tree, a small apple tree. It's very common that the bottom of that tree is not an apple, but a quince. And then what they do this for, they give it like a stalk. Somehow the quince base makes the apple tree a stronger apple tree. That is also in HaTorah to plant, and it goes even further. If you have a kilayim tree, such a harkova, a grafted tree, if it's already growing in your garden, you have to uproot it. So although you are allowed to eat the fruit from a crossbreed, from a harkova of 2 trees, you're allowed to eat the fruit. But if you have a harkova of a branch of one thing which is sitting in the base of another species, you're not allowed to plant them And if you do have them planted, you have a chiyuv actually to uproot them. Right. There's some soif which finds some heter about it, but overall, one should certainly be conscious about this. And apparently, even tomato bushes and things like that, you also have to be careful. Sometimes they actually are grafted, and therefore planting them does raise a question of harkava. I haven't looked into this carefully. Is there a difference between hardoma and ha'etz? I'm not sure. Let's move on. So here's about the right. This is a whole which I discussed just now, which are the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. This is in the Pischei Tshuva in Simulesh Tzadik Dalet. Okay. Here's a fascinating thing now about an esrog. Esrog, it says lakachtem lochem, has to be edible. And if it's esrog from tevel or orlo, it's possible for the entire Yom Tov. Has to be lochem, haroy lochem lechol darke hana osre. It has to, and therefore the esrog has to be edible. But then look at this: the esrog shel orlas chutz la'aretz. Now there's a halacha the following: orlo does apply to chutz la'aretz, but sofek orlo is muter chutz la'aretz. And then he writes the Alter Rebbe, this one Alter Rebbe from Magen Avraham and from the Shiltei Gebarim. And he says the following: an esrog of orlas chutz la'aretz, even though you're not allowed to eat it, mikol mokem, since there are those who allow you to give from the esrog, this orla fruit, to your unwitting colleague, he doesn't know that it's orla. So if so, it's orla achila. So I've got an esrog tree which is 2 years old, and now I'm not allowed to eat the esrog because I know it's less than 3 years old. But I could give it to someone else who doesn't know. It's vaday orla, and still he doesn't know about it. So then I'm allowed to give it to him. There's such a discussion in Gemara Kedushin. And even though the halacha is that you're not allowed to do so, but you can rely on that to be machshir the esrog. Fascinating. It seems to be so, how do you say, counterintuitive that you can an esrog because you could give it to an unwitting consumer. Therefore, it's called royal achila. And even though the halacha is that you can't not allowed to do it, still it's royal achila, and therefore it's kosher for the mitzvah. The poil, that's not what's followed in practice. Yeah, just in case you're worried. In practice, we do make sure that the trees from where we get esrogim will be more than 3 years in the ground. Right, let's move on. I just shared it just because of the sensational aspect of it. Right, so here one of our regular participants is asking about pronunciation, how you pronounce the word osdei migrash orehem. And we've gone through this before, and that is that you have the idea of shvono, shvono is the shva, which is the audible one. When a shvono is called for in a guttural letter, aleph, ches, hey, ayin, they have to be expanded. And that's what the chatofim are. The Pasach Chatov Komas and Chatov Segel, they are typically on letters, under letters, which are Aleph, Hey, Ches, and Ayin, from the guttural letters. But you do have occasionally Chatofim in non-guttural letters. And so what are they? Should it be pronounced Usadeh or Usadeh? So some commentators are saying it's not a real Chatov Pasach, it's just a Shavuot. Okay, accepted it's Shavuot. So how do you pronounce it? Is it Usadeh or Usadeh? This is the question. So on the bottom of the screen, you've got a copy of the Berditchev Tikkun, and I'm going to forgive you for not being able to read it. It's because I expanded it. It's also quite how do you say, not so clear. And thank you to Reb Aaron Chalipsi. About 6 months ago, I mentioned about the Berditchev Tikkun, and then I get one in the mail from him. I said, I don't have one. So he sent one in the mail. So it says Chusarabim. So he writes the following. I'm reading from the original in my hand. If you have two shvoin, you have a shvono, shvonach. Shvono is like the beginning of the following consonant. Shvonach is like the end of the previous consonant. Then that's well-known stuff. Then he says, Sholosh netiyos lishvono. You can have three pronunciations of the shvono. One is when it's followed by a yud, then the shvo will be like a chirik. If it's followed by one of the guttural letters, it will assume the the same vowel as the letter which is preceding. If it's another letter, then it's going to be noitel segel l'das chachmei Ashkenaz. So this is very, very interesting. He's saying that the shvono, can be pronounced in various ways, and it's kind of almost like a chameleon to adopt the well, he says, but the aha is going to adopt uh, like VMS, etc. I'm not sure that's the right example, but what I'm seeing here is shvono is a guttural letter. As a guttural, shvono is meant to be, it's an audible shvo, but how it's pronounced, there's actually room for variations here. Therefore, so the one who asked me this question, my impression, I'm sorry, and the impression I gave last time is just ignore it, just read it today. And how do you pronounce it, Oz Yoshi? Do you say Tsolalu or Tsolalu? But then he says that actually Rabbi Schusterman, we have recordings of his rehearsals, and he pronounces this Usadeh with a Pasachat of Pasach. So what I'm responding to that, okay, so it's what he seems to be saying, it's Taka Ashvona, but your Ashvono is actually can be pronounced a little bit like a Pasach, so it's okay. It can be Usadeh. So it might be a bit of a backtrack to what I'd said last time, but okay. Let's just share with you one last thing, and that is that last week we had the discussion about the phrases in the end of Kiddush Levana, and how I'd mentioned that the earlier Sidurim, as in even in the just before the Alter Rebbe in Tov Kuf Beis and Tov Kuf Hey, Shalosh Siddur Tov Kuf Beis, and Yaakov Emder Siddur Tov Kuf Hey, and there they finish off Hilkoch Tzorach Lemeimer Me'umid. And this Hemshech is not there. I only saw it in a volume from which was published Tov Kuf Yud Beis when the Alter Rebbe was 7 years old, or thereabouts. So I suggested that this extra piece seems to have been added around the Alter Rebbe's times. It became popular in Sidurim. The Alter Rebbe also incorporated it. So Rebbe Zirkin in Western Florida, he somehow dug up some Siddur, which is, you can see it's published in Sulzbach. Tov, it's Tov, Tov Mem, then so it's Tov Samach Aleph, or is it Tov Samach Zayin? Yes, so it's a printed. She has 40 years before the Alter Rebbe, and you have this siddur, and it does have this piece. So, all right, so it was introduced earlier, but curiously, in many Sfarim, it's not there. In many Sidurim at the time, so it seems to be it wasn't across the board, and only in the Alter Rebbe's times does it become across the board. And just to go back to the comments which we had last week, this is slightly different to what we have in the Alter Rebbe Siddur. The Malas P'kim Salvono, the Loye Bo, we have the Loye Bo Shum Miyut. Now he has Shiva Yemei Bereshis. I think we have Shiva As Yemei Bereshis. And then also, I mentioned last week, so we have the beginning of the pasuk. Vayasel Elokim as Shnei Hamoros, but he doesn't have the two words Vayas Elikim. And then again, another change is Viskaim. We have Viskaim Bonu Kosov. He doesn't have the word Bonu, so it's the tefillah is there, as he says rightly, some 40 years before the Alter Rebbe. And I mentioned last week that in the Sefer Tolas Yaakov, it is alluded to, but it looks like it was not totally across the board, and only later on did it become standard in practically all Sidurim, at least in the Ashkenaz world. With that, I'll wish you a good evening and good Shabbos and Vorchem HaChodesh. It should be bringing brocha, special for Klal Yisrael, and Lord bring us the brocha of the Gula Amitis Vashlemo. B'mheir Yameinu Mamash.
Amen.
Yes.